Good yontif to everybody. It's nice to be with you on this second day of Rosh Hashanah. It's a pleasure. And with Cantor Daniel Gale as well, Howard Pfeiffer. I don't think I really even have to say it, because we all know it. Mel Brooks was right. In History of the World, Part 1, what could I be referring to? It's good to be king. Thank you, Ken. It's good to be the king. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It's good to be the king, but it's not necessarily good to have a king. That's a different story. And that's what the great biblical leader Shmuel, Samuel, prophet, judge, king anointer, that's what Samuel told the people when they repeatedly expressed a desire for a monarch. Samuel said, "He will take your sons and appoint them for himself." In other words, your lives will not be your own. A king will take advantage of you. A king will abuse his power. But the people insisted, and God finally told Samuel to relent. Give the people what they want. And thus began the Israelite monarchy. Samuel was right. Israelite kings, more often than not, did what, in the biblical parlance, they did what was displeasing or evil in the eyes of the Lord. They exploited their power. Even the greatest kings did. David, for instance, committed basically murder and adultery just to satisfy an itch. Solomon's outsized ambitions antagonized the entire population and led to a divided nation and to centuries of conflict. Other kings killed Israel's pesky prophets. Other kings set up altars for idols. Other kings waged unjust wars. But the people continued to want their kings, and that's what they got. There's something known as the authoritarian personality. The authoritarian personality does not refer to the authoritarian himself. Rather, it refers to the human instinct, our instinct, to want and to adore and to glom onto an authoritarian figure. Such a leader promises that he and he alone can solve problems, can withstand relentless attacks on himself, and that he can return a nation, any nation, to some mythological bygone glory. This person also tends to fabricate enemies within their societies, blaming the enemies, so-called, for his and for the nation's problems. These enemies are typically weak and marginalized people, and therefore easily targeted and easily persecuted as well. Unless you think otherwise, this is not the story of one man, and this is not the story of one country. This story has been on repeat throughout history, in every continent, every century, within every political system. This is the story of the tyrant. This is the story of the strongman. Beware. We Jews must be especially wary and vigilant, for we, as minorities, have been gullible and credulous and trusting to our peril. Note this incredible but true passage from an editorial in a German Jewish newspaper, the year 1933. Quote, "We do not subscribe to the view that Mr. Hitler and his friends, now finally in possession of the power they have so long desired, will implement their proposals." Won't they? The editorial goes on. They will not suddenly deprive German Jews of their constitutional rights, nor enclose them in ghettos, nor subject them to the jealous and murderous impulses of the mob. Oh no? They clearly, the editorial continues, they clearly do not want to go down that road. A Jewish newspaper, 1933, painful and disturbing to read. We are flabbergasted, not only because we know how that turned out, mystified, not merely because educated Germans indeed did hand over their autonomy and their independence to a strongman. We are astounded also because many German Jews, like the editorial board of that newspaper, refused, many educated German Jews, as so many of us were, really, that population. They refused to believe that Mr. Hitler would do precisely what he said he would do. He did go down that road. He did indeed. But for sure, that was then, and that was there, and this is now. 21st century America. It cannot happen here. And I'm not saying that sardonically. I am tentatively, I should say the only reason I am confident about that it cannot happen here. The only reason tyranny seems unfathomable to us here and now is because our nation's founders did indeed fathom it back then. They fathomed the possibility of tyranny 250 years ago. They fathomed fascism. They understood it. They understood tyranny. They had experienced it. So our founders took very careful measures to prevent the rise of a strongman on American soil. The Constitution functions as a bulwark against tyranny. The very beginning, Article 1, Section 1, the entire Article 1 describes not the presidency. It doesn't begin with the executive branch. It begins with the legislature. Article 2 describes the presidency and the executive branch. And then Article 3 describes the judiciary. Isn't that interesting? So at the very beginning of the Constitution, the president's powers are literally surrounded by the other branches, which check him, which balance him out. Early writings about the presidency, including the Federalist Papers, refer repeatedly to the King of Britain as an office with, quote, too great a share of power. Our founding documents protect us from that. So the words are good, but people are people. And despite what is written on the parchment, which is important, it is the law. But despite what is written on the parchment, we human beings do not fundamentally change. We are still, because it's something in our nature, we are drawn to the strong man. Remember Phil? Speaking of Mel Brooks, remember Phil from Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner's 2,000-Year-Old Man? Do you remember Phil? Phil was a bully, and the early humans, according to the 2,000-Year-Old Man, the early humans worshipped him, because if we didn't worship Phil, he'd beat us up. But then something happened to Phil. What happened to Phil? He was struck by lightning. And we all, early humans, looked up at the sky with Phil smoldering on the ground. We all looked up at the sky and we said, there's something bigger than Phil. So basically, we traded one strong man for another. We are drawn to the strong man. Timothy Snyder, in his invaluable little book called Tyranny, from 2017, writes this: Americans, that's us, Americans are no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism and communism. Our one advantage, he writes, is that we might learn from history. So we better learn. We should be wary of any attempt by any president to abuse the office or circumvent the law. Be wary how wannabe fascists talk about outsiders, for instance, and treat the vulnerable. Be wary of their promises to fix everything. Be wary of their use of executive power. Be wary of their obsession with loyalty. Be wary of any cult of personality. We might find it endearing, the way they talk, their oration, their bluster, their charisma. And by the way, this applies to all of us and to every possible leader of this country. We might find all of that endearing, attractive, appealing. Don't get caught up. That's a Jewish lesson. Perkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, warns us that getting too close to those in authority compromises our values. And so evaluate the policy. Always be wary of the person. Moreover, and very significantly, if they do anything inimical to our values or your safety, take that very seriously. Do not think that you can win them over or curry favor with them. We can't. Some German Jews in 1930s Germany, writes Professor Snyder of Yale, author of Tyranny. Some of German Jews at that time, quote, voted as the Nazi leaders wanted them to vote, in the hope that this gesture of loyalty would bind the new system to them. That, Snyder writes, was a vain hope. And that, I would say, is understatement. So be wary. And we must be equally wary of another danger. It's not charismatic individuals, but it is enticing ideologies, overarching, unifying beliefs that offer easy answers to complicated problems, ideologies and isms, hip, all-encompassing, and non-negotiable isms that dictate our thoughts, our political opinions, our language, what we read. These are your mores. These are your norms. This is what you should believe. This is not the story of the strongman. This is the peril of groupthink. Groupthink. And it didn't stop with those crazed young Maoists decades ago. You might remember them. Its gravitational pull, the pull, appeal, etc. of groupthink prevails today, most prominently on some college campuses, where a combination of persuasive professors and peer pressure dictate what is and what is not acceptable for young American minds on campus. Of course, we all know, alarmingly, non-acceptable ism number one is our ism, or our isms, Zionism, Judaism. Why is that? That's a big question. A cynical view is that opposing the Jewish state, its very existence, is a way to awaken, I would say just another way to awaken an ancient hatred, Jew hatred. A more charitable view is that opposing the Jewish state now in these communities, these campus communities, offers an easy way to convince students that they are doing something good for the world, while releasing them from uncomfortable truths. Uncomfortable truths like, number one, their professors are exploiting them and their graduate student teachers' aides. Number two, that there are actually significant problems that they can do something about, like homeless children 3/4 of a mile from campus. And number three, uncomfortable truth number three for them is that the purpose of college is actually to read books, great books, to engage in challenging discussions with actual scholars, not activists, and to grow intellectually. College, study, think, learn, or college, pitch a tent on the quad and chant slogans. From college campuses to comedy venues. Maybe you've seen on YouTube how Jerry Seinfeld has been heckled recently in his shows while doing stand-up. Not because he wasn't funny. He's funny, but because he supports Israel and has been vocal about that. Ultimately, it's because he's Jewish, which he himself alluded to in his takedown of hecklers at a show this summer. He shouted to them, "It's the Jew comedians, that's who we have to get." This summer also brought an almost comical irony when a Brooklyn bookstore canceled an event featuring a progressive author and a well-known progressive rabbi, because the rabbi is a very progressive Zionist. The rabbi's name is Andy Bachman, and in the New York Times, which reported on this, he noted the absurdity. He said, "You're selling the book, but we can't talk about the book." I experienced this sort of thing years ago in law school, in the early 90s, when some classmates expressed views that did not fall in line. Professors and fellow students did not merely disagree with them, they scorned them. I can still hear the snickers, literally. I can still hear the snickers in a civil liberties class when a couple of students expressed a view, I believe it was about parental consent, when a minor gets pregnant and wants to have an abortion. That was what we're discussing. It's a constitutional issue, for sure. But a few students earnestly presented an opinion or expressed an opinion that did not conform with the majority, well-meaning young people. I recall another time when a professor yelled at a student, really yelled, a student who suggested a view the professor disagreed with. The poor kid, I remember this, was absolutely excoriated in front of scores of other students. It was a big class, all for expressing an opinion in law school, where diversity of opinions you would think would be welcomed. The students looked uncomfortable, but honestly, he did not look surprised. That was the culture. And the drubbing down surely had the chilling effect on a free exchange of ideas in law school. Neither of these dangers, the strongman and groupthink, neither reflect Jewish values at all. Our greatest leader, Moses was the anti-strongman, extreme in humility. He admitted when he was wrong. Imagine that from a leader. Moses once rebuked Aaron, his older brother. Moses rebuked Aaron for not keeping a certain law about eating the sacrifices by a certain time. Aaron stood his ground, and Moses backed down. Moses also never put people down, even when he had reason to. When his sister, also older, Miriam, did something terrible, she slandered him in front of the entire community, the entire nation. God punished her with a skin disease, and Moses prayed for her healing. A good leader rises above petty resentments and petty self-interests. A good leader pursues the mission and serves the people, not himself or herself. Howard Feynman, veteran journalist, you might remember he died this summer. Howard Feynman wrote about how George Washington was flatly uninterested in self-promotion. Washington, wrote Feynman, quote, had left his farm to fight the Revolutionary War, done his duty in it, and returned home. There were those who wanted to deify him, make him into a god. Washington would have none of it. Jewish tradition is equally wary of groupthink, I would say myopic groupthink. Our sages devised a thinking tradition that prizes not conformity, but diversity. The Talmud records not only the sages' majority opinions, but their minority opinions too, and not with a snicker, but with respect. In the wake of one vigorous debate over something I would say fairly trivial, about whether a repaired oven was kosher or not, there was a right answer and there was a wrong answer ultimately. But ultimately, a voice from heaven, a bat kol, proclaimed, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These opinions and those opinions, The right opinion and the wrong opinion, majority and minority, they're all the words of the living God. That's the Jewish way. The right and wrong. A voice from heaven said, this one's right, but it's all b'shem shemayim. It's all in the name of heaven. The entire argument, all the airing of different opinions, they're all the words of the living God. That, friends, is the Jewish way. And that's also the American way. Underlying the freedoms of expression guaranteed by the First Amendment is the principle that all viewpoints, even the very challenging ones, deserve a hearing. We in America seriously must discover that value anew. We are an open-minded culture. We are not a cancel culture. That's who we are. The Supreme Court likewise has been publishing majority and minority opinions, dissents, for a couple of centuries. Doing so, according to the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, offers the potential to, quote, refine and clarify the opposing majority opinion. That's open-minded. And her ideological opponent and her friend, the late Justice Antonin Scalia, wrote that today's dissenting opinion may lay the foundation for tomorrow's majority opinion. That's open-minded. Friends, Americans, Jews, we are lucky. We have inherited two of history's most dynamic and inspiring intellectual traditions. Traditions at some risk right now. So let us teach our children well. Let us teach them to be independent and not conforming. Teach them to be thoughtful and not reactive. Teach them and demonstrate for them to be suspicious of the simplistic solutions of seductive isms and of the bloviating promises of Big Brother wannabes. L'shana tova.